Hey there, and thank you so much for tuning in to another Ask Me Anything session. This is a series where I am answering questions that you submit to me in the comments about the publishing industry, writing a better book, and anything in between. I want to do as much as I can to support you on your publishing and writing journey, so I'm really glad that we've been able to do these sessions and that so many of you are getting a lot out of them. Before we dive in, I just want to give a few reminders. First, if you haven't subscribed already, please go ahead and hit that subscribe button to help me grow this amazing, wonderful community. And while you're at it, hit that thumbs up button because it really helps out my channel. And I have a free resource for any writer who has a current work in progress in the description below. It is called my Story Self-Assessment Worksheet, and it is designed to be a fun, easy, simple quiz that's going to help you get a fresh perspective on your manuscript and see it from another lens. It can really help rejuvenate you if you are currently just in the thick of writing or revising and you really can't see the forest from the trees. Downloading that is going to opt you into my newsletter where I publish exclusive interviews with successful authors and publishing industry professionals, so you don't want to miss out on all of their amazing tips. If you just want to check out the newsletter, the link to that is in the description as well. As always, thank you to everyone who submitted great questions, and I'm excited to dive in today. The first question here is about sequels and a synopsis. Do we mention the sequels or events that trigger them in the synopsis? Or should we treat it as a standalone book while writing the synopsis? This is a great question. I get a lot of questions about both sequels and synopses, so it is great that we're talking about them together here. If you have a book that you are querying that you envision being part of a series or the first installment of a series, you still will want to treat that as standalone in the query letter itself and in the synopsis to maximize your chances of engaging a literary agent. That's because, especially from a debut author, it is very, very difficult for a literary agent to make a deal with a major publishing house to publish 2 or 3 books from this new author because frankly, you just haven't established yourself yet, and a publishing house is a business and they are unlikely to want to take on that risk. That's why I strongly recommend crafting the first installment of your book in such a way that it can be read as standalone. That way, in both your query letter and in your synopsis, you can present it as standalone, but mention to the literary agent that there is potential to pick up with another installment in the series if that book does well. So when you are approaching the synopsis, you will just want to cover what happens in that initial book, and you will not need to go into any details about a sequel. Here's the next question. When you get published, can you have your payments go out to a self-owned company, for example, if you're using a pen name? Many authors, once they establish their career, either the self-publishing route or via a traditional publishing house, do establish LLCs for their book business. This is extremely common because for tax purposes, it can be very helpful to have those payments go through an LLC versus just go to you directly as the author. So if you are in a position where you're making significant money from your books, again, either via a publishing house or via self-publishing, it is a good idea to look into creating an LLC for your books. After all, this is definitely a source of income for you and a business in and of itself for you. So it is worth looking into, and it is something I saw quite a bit when I was working in the industry and we were paying authors. Next question here. I was wondering, at what stage of getting your manuscript together do you include dedications to people? Is that something the publishing house asks you later when the book goes to print, or is that something you include in the initial manuscript submission? The dedication page is a standard part of a published book. Many published books do have dedications, many of which are very personal for the author, but in terms of having a dedication at the draft stage, you don't need to. If you already know who you want to dedicate your book to and you put it in your full manuscript, that's totally fine. But whenever you are submitting pages to literary agents, especially in the query, where you are pasting just the first 10 pages, do not include the dedication. It's always something you can add later on, so if you don't have a dedication in mind yet, or you're still ruminating on it, it's not something you need to have ready at this stage. Here's the next question. I have a question about the content of a query. Should a fan fiction writer mention their work in the query? I understand that fan fiction can be looked down on by people in the publishing industry, but if I had, say, over 3,000 hits on my fiction per week, would it be worth mentioning? This is a good question, and I have to say that when I was in the industry and reviewing queries, I don't think I ever came across a query where an author mentioned that they have written fan fiction or mentioned the traffic that they got on their works. But personally, I don't see why you couldn't mention it, particularly if you do have a bit of an established presence in the fanfiction community like you mentioned. What that would show me is that people are gravitating towards your writing. You have some type of storytelling ability that people are drawn to, and that could be a plus when an agent is looking at your query. If you write fan fiction for fun and you haven't published it, or you don't really have an established readership, then I would say it's not necessary to mention it in your author bio. But if you do have some kind of established audience or readership, it could be worth mentioning. It also could be worth mentioning if your fan fiction has any bearing on the book project you are currently querying. For instance, if your fan fiction work falls into the paranormal space and you are now seeking representation for a paranormal romance, I could see that connection making sense to an agent in the query letter. Only mention it if you feel comfortable doing so, and personally, I don't see why an agent would look down on you mentioning your fan fiction, especially if, as I said, you do have a strong readership with it. Here's a question about structuring a novel. Wondering if you have any structural advice when writing a novel with a story within a story. In my case, my primary/frame story is about the search for the missing ending of a dead author's final book, and I hope to include scenes from that story within a story that reflect on my protagonist's themes. My concern is pulling the reader out of the primary story with too many interruptions. Thanks. First, this sounds like a really intriguing premise for a book, and I like that you're thinking about the structure as a story within a story and you have these dual narratives unfolding. It sounds really interesting. I especially love questions about structuring a narrative because I am a structural/developmental book editor, so this is really what I do day in and day out. I'm always thinking about what is the best way to present this story and what is going to make for the best reader experience of this particular story. In this case, I totally see why you have the inclination to include elements from that story that the main character is trying to find the ending to. I think it could add an element of intrigue, right? Because we will then be equally as immersed in the story within a story that the main character is already privy to. And in a way, you will make the reader all the more intrigued to also find the ending, right? That to me sounds a bit more compelling than having the protagonist search for an ending to a story that we personally have no investment in, and we personally have no idea what even is going on in that story. So I like what you're thinking with this. But as you say, it is critical with any type of dual narrative structure, not just a story within a story, but a present and past timeline, for instance, or a storyline with this character and a storyline with this character. Any situation where you have multiple narratives unfolding simultaneously, it is critical that the reader is equally invested in both of them, and one of them doesn't then feel like a distraction from the main one. In your case, there is a clear hierarchy between the narratives, right? They are not necessarily equally weighted because this primary narrative is definitely the primary narrative, and the story within a story is really just more context for the reader and a break to ruminate on what's going on in the main narrative. You can also establish suspense that way by pausing the main narrative, especially at a climactic moment, to then delve into this story within a story. So in your case, my advice would be to not keep the story within a story sections too long. If they go on for pages and pages and pages and pages, then that's when the reader is going to feel itchy to return to the main narrative. So make sure that they feel like a reprieve and a break, a pause in the main narrative, a chance for the reader to catch their breath, but that they don't end up making us lose sight of the main narrative, right, if they are too lengthy. Also, in your case, I would make sure that you establish a pattern of when you are going to switch to this story within a story. It's going to be very jarring for the reader if you just drop one in and then never show another scene from this story within a story, or if you wait until 75% of the way through the story and then you suddenly drop this scene that's actually taking place in the story within a story, right? So I would say sprinkle it in at an even cadence, maybe every 4 or 2 chapters, something like that, a brief scene of the story within the story, so that the reader can easily keep track of the progression of both narratives. That's all we had time for today. Thank you so much to everyone who's tuning in. And if you have a question you'd like to ask me, drop it in the comments here and it will be added to my queue. As I mentioned before, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, hit that like button as well to help out my channel. And don't forget your free story self-assessment worksheet and my newsletter link in the description below. Thanks so much for watching and happy writing.